This is the very first boat that I ever built, and it's really not much of a boat. It's more of a glorified box with a sail and a rudder. I had some plans that I think came from an old Popular Mechanics article that I dug up on the internet somewhere, and most of the lumber was just some dusty old wood that I drug out of the barn. And then I bought a couple of sheets of plywood for the deck and the bottom, and I got in this thing and I headed out downwind, sailed all the way out of the bay, not knowing if I would actually be able to tack my way back up the bay when it came time. For how small of a boat it was kind of a long journey. And I slept up on this cliff, and when I got up the next morning and I was ready to go back, I set out, had to kind of paddle into the waves a little bit, got the sail up, and it was kind of going to weather. It was making a beam reach at best, and couldn't get the boat to come about. Ended up more or less getting blown back to shore, and the boat sat right there on the rocks. And I realized I was not going to be leaving that place by water that day. So I ended up having to hike back. Came back when the weather was a little calmer and the wind had changed directions. I hiked back in and recovered the boat. So I guess that was kind of a failure, or maybe it was just an adventure. So that little experience kind of whet my beak for sailing, and I soon stepped up to a fiberglass 19-foot O'Day Mariner. And that was a really good boat. Still have it to this day, and I learned a lot more about sailing on that boat. But it was a little bit too much for me to handle by myself, especially trailering it and raising the mast by myself. A little bit cumbersome to have to do that every time you want to put into the water, because I couldn't afford a slip to keep it in a marina or anything like that. So then I kind of went through a phase where I was buying and selling a bunch of different small fiberglass dinghies, and so I got to sail a bunch of different ones. I just couldn't find one that I really loved that I wanted to hang on to, so I did some buying and selling. I made a little bit of money, definitely lost some money. Probably came out even in the end, but I gained a lot of knowledge about sailing from sailing a bunch of these different little dinghies, which were all good boats, and I had some fun adventures in them, but I still felt that something was missing. I think it was that sound. I couldn't get that sound of water lapping on a wooden hull out of my head. I just remembered that from the first wooden boat I built. There's just something about it. It's a lot different than a fiberglass or a plastic boat. It has more of a soul to it. It sounds cliche, but it really does. It's a different experience when you're sailing a wooden boat. So over the course of 5 or 6 years, I probably built 5 or 6 sort of micro semi-disposable boats, just kind of little toy boats. And I learned a lot from that. Each one got a little bit better and a little bit more complex hull shape. They're still all flat-bottom boats, but I'd come a long way from that very first little box boat. But finally, after I had gained a little bit of experience building all these toy boats, I decided it was time to build a real one. And I wanted something that would be historical, would be practical for exploring and landing on beaches and camping out of. And even though I'd gained a lot of skill in boat building, I was still far from a master craftsman. So the choice was pretty obvious. I decided I would build a Sharpie, a small Sharpie for the type, but I still call it a Sharpie. You might call it a flat iron skiff, but really it's quite a bit narrower than a flat iron skiff. It would be 15 foot, open, sail and oars, and I would build it out of whatever local materials I could get, the best materials that I could track down. Most of my research came from the Sharpie book, which is all about small flat-bottom working craft. I was mainly looking at the crab skiff, the Mississippi River yawl, and the smaller undecked skiffs that still meet the definition of a Sharpie. This boat is constructed like a Sharpie, and proportionally it meets the definition. But I usually just call it a skiff, it doesn't really matter. Other than the Sharpie book, I had a couple of other plans that I had looked at from various sources, and this boat was to be my own. It's not based on one specific plan. It's kind of an amalgamation just based on all of my research. And that's kind of the way the American watermen of the 1800s would have done it. It would have been not based on written plans for the most part. A lot of them would have been building their own working boat, and you would just kind of look at one that you like, maybe take some measurements, and make out the beam and the angle of the topside flare and angle of the stem and stuff like that, and you just kind of build it based on sight and based on experience and the way that other people have done it. It's a very, very simple boat to construct. Basically just nail the top sides to your stem or apron, and then you bend them around a single frame that's secured to a strong back and fasten it to the transom, put the bottom on, and put the seats and everything in it. You got a boat. So that's the way I decided to do it, just to stay true to the old everyman way of construction. The apron I cut out of a 4x4 treated lumber, and I just ran it through a table saw. The side planking was the best that I could find locally, and I mean very locally, not from a commercial place, but just from a local lumber yard we have here. The best boards I could find in the length and width that I needed ended up being spruce, which is not ideal due to its lack of rot resistance. But I figured that it really wasn't going to make all that much of a difference for a trailer boat that's only going to be in fresh water. At most, it's going to be in the water for, say, 48 hours at a time, but even that'll be pretty rare. So as long as I keep it painted and keep the wood dry, it should last quite a long time. And the boards for the top side were far from perfect. I mean, you can see they've got quite a few small knots in them. I mean, I really went through the whole lumber pile, tried to get the best quality ones that I could. They ended up still having some small knots, but none of the knots were very deep at all. They weren't spreading out cracks or anything, and I tried to avoid having knots at the midsection of the plank where most of the bend is going to take place. Made the mold out of 3/4 inch plywood that I just happened to have laying around. I find that the easiest way to bend the top sides, if you don't have anybody to help you, is to use ratchet straps and to use 2 sets of them and alternate by tightening one strap at a time, and that makes it really easy. Didn't have any problem bending the wood at all. Once you've got your top sides fastened to your apron and to your transom, the rest of the boat pretty much builds itself. I'd learned from my previous builds the most important thing is to not rush the process. Really focus on what you're doing, think several steps ahead, and if you get frustrated or angry, just quit and come back and work on the boat another day, because when you're frustrated, you're more likely to do something stupid and get in a hurry and make a mistake. Once I got a coat of paint on the boat, it was time to expose it to the light of day for the first time and head down to the lake for the maiden voyage. The first test would be with only rowing gear on a very small lake adjacent to the Cumberland, dammed off from the main Barkley Reservoir. And it was a good day. I had a nice time just floating and looking at the boat, seeing how it was balanced, how it felt in the water, and I was pretty satisfied overall. Definitely more satisfied than with any other boat I had built to this point. The one thing that bothered me, the stern was sitting a little bit lower than I thought it should, and the bow was sitting a little too high. And this seems to have been due maybe to the heavy red oak transom. But I would find out later that with the centerboard and all the sailing gear, the boat ended up being balanced just about perfectly, trimmed just about perfectly. And of course, with the addition of a passenger in the front rowing thwart, or with gear in the front of the boat, it sits about right in the water. The boat rode pretty easily, but of course it's not like rowing a very light, modern plastic boat that weighs nothing. This is a heavy boat. It's heavily built, it's heavy duty, and it does take a little bit of effort to row it, but considering what it does weigh and how much gear and how much weight it can haul, it's a fairly efficient rower for what it is. It does have a pretty long skeg that keeps it going straight, which I really like for rowing. The next project was to develop all the sailing gear, and this is kind of still an ongoing process. I just kind of went with some sails that I already had. Actually, I sewed the mainsail with help from my mom, and the mizzen is just a jib from my O'Day Sprite. And the boat is under canvas, but for my type of sailing, for just casual sailing and exploring, it does the job. It's pretty good. At some point in the future, I may go to just a single, larger lug sail. Or I might also look at the typical Sharpie rig of the 2 leg of mutton sails. But I'm very satisfied with the sailing characteristics of this boat. It does go to weather, not very close, but closer than a beam reach, so you can definitely make progress to windward when you need to.
Oh.